Good evening and welcome to tonight's event, Untold Stories from This Broken Hill. My name is Colin Weiser. I'm the Silber Family Professor of Modern Jewish Studies and the Acting Director of York University's Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies. Iconic Canadian singer, poet, and author Leonard Cohen needs, of course, no introduction. He is beloved around the world. Tonight, we'll bring you a conversation with author Michael Posner about the second volume of his three-part biography of Cohen, Untold Stories. But before we proceed, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors for this event: the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies, Hillel at York University, the Robart Center for Canadian Studies, York's Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies, and York's Departments of History, Humanities, and English and Creative Writing. Tonight's event is part of a large series of Canadian Jewish literary programs that have made the Koshitsky Center one of the preeminent hosts and curators of programming about Jewish life and letters in Canada. These events include not only book launches and interviews with authors, but also the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards, the CJN's Young Writers Contests, and the Canadian Jewish Literary Fiction Panel. In the coming weeks, we have two exciting events that I'd like to share with you tonight. The first is the launch of Shadows in the City of Light, Paris and Post-War French Jewish Writing, which is scheduled for the 27th of January, which is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This is a collection of essays edited by center colleagues Sarah Horowitz, Amira Dan, and Julia Crete about novels and memoirs that capture and probe the absences of deported Parisian Jews. The second event that we're very excited about is Monsters, Machines, and Modern Jews, a conversation with best-selling fiction writer and essayist Nathan Englander, which will take place in late February. All of our events are currently online, so neither the weather nor the pandemic will get in our way. Stay tuned for further details. At this point, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Professor David Kaufman, who will commence tonight's event.
Thank you so much, Colin, and welcome everybody. My name is David Kaufman. I'm the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry and the Associate Director here of York's Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies. We're delighted that you could join us for this sequel event with Michael Posner, whom we welcome back to talk about his new book. The book is, as Colin said, the second volume in a trilogy of untold stories, the product of countless hours of interviews and research, which offers what I think should be considered the definitive oral history collection of perspectives on Cohen's work, his lives, his loves, from dozens upon dozens of people with whom he was connected. The collection is really an essential companion to Leonard's own writings and his archives, which are located here in Toronto, and the really fascinating cottage industry of Cohen's scholarship. And I hope many of you will be inspired to buy a copy of at least one of these books. The third one should be out next year, I believe. And Julie's going to drop a link in the chat now for purchasing yourself a copy. I also wanted to acknowledge that though we're remote tonight, we all have real bodies, and that these bodies live, work, and love in real space on real lands, each of which has its own history and politics. So I'm speaking today from my home in downtown Toronto on the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, among others. This is land that's covered under the 1805 Toronto Purchase, Treaty 13, territory that remains subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and a consortium of Anishinaabe peoples and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. In conversation with Michael tonight is our Center for Jewish Studies colleague and recently minted PhD, Dr. Leslie Simpson, a freelance journalist, a teacher here at York and beyond, and a writer in her own right. I'll let Leslie guide us through the evening. I just wanted to invite you all to use the Q&A function on your Zoom screens to write in questions for our guest as the discussion unfolds. We'll turn to these questions in the last fourth or fifth of the program Your questions will be the minor fall or the major lift, as it were. Leslie, over to you.
Thank you, David, and good evening. I want to welcome everybody tonight. Really delighted that you're here. And especially, of course, thank Michael Posner for making himself available for our second conversation about his project, a 3-volume oral biography. Tonight, we're going to have a conversation about Leonard Cohen, Untold Stories from This Broken Hill, Volume 2. And as Kalman and David mentioned, if any of you missed our first conversation and you want to catch up later, I invite you to have a look at it. It was recorded, a conversation moderated by Professor David Kaufman with Michael Posner about the first book. And that online book launch had some fabulous questions from you, our online audience, and you can catch up at your convenience. The book is written like a play in what Michael Posner has called the Cohenian choir. A little bit of a word about the format and how this evening is going to unfold. Tonight, the format will be similar, but not identical to our first event, in that we'd like to share a little sneak preview of Volume 2 with you, then have a conversation with Michael, and finally open up the floor to you to ask your questions. Julie Feinberg will moderate the Q&A, but please feel free, if at any time in the evening you have a question, feel free to submit it. And we promise we will get to as many as we can. We really want to thank you for joining us this evening. The original plan was to have this event in my Toronto living room. This is not a joke. And I'm going to keep this offer open for Volume 3, in case we're in a different COVID landscape. Despair is a luxury that we cannot afford. And now to begin. As David and Kalman have mentioned, the book is an oral biography that feels like reading a play. And so as a reader, we listen to conversations with people in Leonard Cohen's life. Family, friends, lovers, artists, film directors, journalists, comedians, translators, people in diverse worlds of music, law, art, business, Jewish friends and family, foes, as well as people from the Zen monastery world. So as a reader, it feels like being a fly on the wall of a fluid, unpredictable conversation with a lot of twists and turns, a bit like a wild car ride. The Cohenian choir includes small players, like the Montreal waitress who remembers what Leonard Cohen liked to eat, and bigger players, including the previously unnamed Costa Rican lover and translator of Lorca, who was betrayed by Leonard Cohen's abandonment and infidelity. As a reader, this book to me feels like I had to be a detective because it's full of deliberate juxtapositions of contradictions, omissions, and I had to kind of figure out who to trust and who to be wary of. So tonight, we decided we wanted to take our cue from this innovation of oral biography and do something unconventional and give everybody here a sense of what the book sounds like. So drum roll, please. Our own Cohenian choir is about to make its debut this evening. Dare I say hallelujah? I would like to thank in advance our cast, and you will see them identified on the screen. Kalman Weiser, David Kaufman, Julie Feinberg, Marty Roshwerg, Erwin Kotler, Stephen Brooke, and myself, Leslie Simpson. Now, for those of you who would like to follow along with your own copies, if you have the physical book with you, you can turn to page 105. This is a section that I've selected from chapter 3, and the chapter 3 is called, Are You in Love with Me Yet? Since Michael interviewed more than 500 people and counting, you'll be delighted to know that at the back of the book, there's a cast of characters in alphabetical order, and it gives you the person's name as well as that person's connection to Leonard Cohen. The list will help you get oriented and prevent that feeling of being car sick, when you're reading a Russian novel and getting dizzy, trying to keep all the names straight. So I want to set the scene up for our reading with some context for some people who may not have yet read either book. Leonard Cohen had been raised in a Montreal Jewish family that was affluent, active, and kind of part of Montreal Jewish royalty. His father, Nathan, owned a clothing store. Nathan was one of the first Canadian Jewish military officers in World War I, so he had a military pedigree. Leonard's father died when he was only 9 years old. And in the book, we hear from people close to him that Leonard Cohen believed in the notion of a just war. He grew up with respect for a military pedigree. His band kind of functioned like his army. And he disagreed with the Beatles' motto, "All you need is love." He considered the Beatles wussy. He was more politically right-wing on Israel, believing in hawkish foreign policy. But he kept these views quiet because his fan base was politically more liberal. He characterized his own political position once as right of right. And some in his circle said he was against gun control and a fan of Ronald Reagan, a Republican. So I want to set up the scene that you're going to hear now. In 1964, Leonard Cohen gave a talk in Montreal, and he critiqued Jewish life in Canada. He said that Jewish life in Canada was in a crisis because, quote, "we no longer believe we are holy," close quote, and that the absence of God in our midst is part of the emptiness of exile of life in Canada. You can hear the speech if you want to listen later because it was recorded. So about 9 years after this speech, Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack on Israel on the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. The surprise meant Israel was caught, in the words of one military observer, with its pants down. And the 1973 war was a war that profoundly affected the country to this day. So please give a warm welcome to our cast. We're going to start, the passage begins with the war in 1973. Canadian writer and producer Barry Wexler, a friend of Leonard Cohen's, will be played by David Kaufman. Ori Levy, an Israeli actor, will be played by Alan Weinbaum. Oshik Levy, an Israeli singer, will be played by Marty Roshwerg. Rachel Terry, an Israeli-American model, Olympian, lover, will be played by Julie Feinberg. Shmuel Zemech, the Israeli impresario, played by Stephen Brook. Erwin Kotler, Canadian lawyer, politician, and friend, played by Erwin Kotler. Robert Humphrey, a Canadian writer, played by Kalman Weiser. So if anyone has a physical book, we're going to start at the bottom of page 105. And myself, Leslie Simpson, I'm going to function as your narrator. So it's 1973. We're starting now. Cohen and Wexler were rushing to Israel before it closed the country's airspace. Waiting in line to board his plane, Cohen met a young couple, Usher, an American convert, and his wife, Israeli wife, Margalit. Usher had undergone adult circumcision, which impressed Cohen. He spent the first night as a guest of Margalit's mother in Herzliya, and the next day went to the beach with them. A friendship formed. Arriving in Tel Aviv, Cohen booked into the Gad Hotel, a pension on Hayarkon, with a distant view of the Mediterranean. He immediately set off in search of Rachel Terry, the Israeli model he'd met the previous year, at Panati, an artist cafe on Dizengoff Street. Terry wasn't there, but others were, including actor Ori Levy, who recognized him.
I introduced myself and asked him what he was doing here. He answered me that at a time like this, he needed to be in Israel. I asked him if he wanted to perform for the soldiers. He said, "Of course, yes." This was why he came.
They were soon joined by the singer, Oshik Levy.
Cohen said he had flown to Israel out of a sense of mission and a desire to take an active part in the war.
Ori Levy then took him to see Shmuel Zemech, who produced entertainment for soldiers. Eventually, Cohen made contact with Terry.
He asked me if he should go to the front line, and I said, go.
Leonard had wanted to work on a kibbutz. I told him that that would be a total waste. I dragged him to war. He said, "My songs are sad. They'll only make the troops feel worse." I said, "It'll be okay." I was putting together a group with Pupa Karnon, Maddie Caspi, and Ilana Rovina. By the second evening, we were headed towards the Hatzor base in a 1961 Ford Falcon. Cohen had no idea where he was going and was afraid. He'd never been so close to war, and Israel was in a state of chaos. There were many losses. The reports upset him. We tried to dispel each other's fears. None of us knew what we might be getting into.
At Hatzor, Levy announced, "We have a special guest, Leonard Cohen." Maddie Caspi accompanied Cohen on the guitar.
The fact that there were no decent conditions to mount a show in, certainly not the kind he was used to, did not bother him. He went on stage with a classical guitar and no amplification, but a single microphone a soldier volunteered to hold for him. While quite a few soldiers didn't know who Cohen was, others identified his songs and were very touched that Cohen had come to be with them. For those who knew Cohen, his show was a private, intimate performance. It was a musical escape from hell. During one show, before Cohen sang, "So Long, Marianne," he told the soldiers, this song should be listened to at home, with a drink in one hand and your other arm around a woman you love. I hope you'll have that soon. Between the second and third performance, he wrote, "Lover, lover, lover."
Shmuel Zemech, then chairman of Israel's Association of Impresarios and Stage Producers, remembers Cohen's performance in the Golan Heights after the Golani Brigade recaptured Mount Hermon. In that battle, some 80 Israeli soldiers had been killed, dozens more wounded.
Very moment we were asked to bring the artists on stage. The excitement, energy, and joy, mixed as they were with terrible sadness, created the most moving performance I ever saw. It's a show I'll never forget.
During a short break from performing, Cohen returned to Tel Aviv and ran into Erwin Kotler, a Montreal friend, in a cafe.
He'd been at the front and was going back. He needed to express his solidarity with Israel. Although he was then with Suzanne, Marianne was the great love of his life. I also had a Marianne in my life, and I discussed it with him. She had wanted to get married and I wasn't ready. He understood. I told him I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. That was the subject of our discussion.
A few days later, Cohen rejoined the troupe. It performed about 8, sometimes 10 times a day for a few weeks.
In every place, he wanted to be drafted, a paratrooper, a Marine, a pilot. On some bases, I tried to get him preferential treatment, a room to sleep in, decent food instead of army rations. He wouldn't allow it. The three of us slept in sleeping bags in the canteen. He never complained, not once. We went from base to base, hospital to hospital. Cohen wanted to speak with soldiers, from the highest ranking commander to the newest recruit. He admired them, simply because they fought. The sights were hard for everybody, and particularly for Cohen, exposed to war for the first time.
According to Levy, Cohen found release from the tension of war by discussing astrology and Greek philosophy with Arnon, and by writing in his notebook. The tour at times bordered on the bizarre.
You'd see 8 soldiers around a 175 millimeter cannon, and you're supposed to stand and sing. In mid-song, the officer would say, "Hold on," and they'd lift the cannon, charge it, and shoot. Then you'd go on with the performance. It was a terrible war, and the sights were difficult to see.
Later, Cohen accompanied troops to the African side of the canal. At a deserted airport, converted into an emergency hospital, he saw a giant can of mashed potatoes labeled "A gift from the people of Canada."
He also found a .45 pistol in a holster among some old clothes and took it. A helicopter landed outside full of wounded men. He assumed that these were Israelis and had to stop himself from weeping. Then he learned they were Egyptians. He described initially feeling relieved, then terribly guilty for feeling relieved.
In Ismailia, Cohen shared cognac with Israeli general and future prime minister Ariel Sharon.
Cohen said he mused about becoming a general himself, having Sharon's job, trading in his pen to become the lion of the desert. En route back to the airport, their Jeep came under attack and they had to take cover.
When the tour ended, Cohen took a bus to Jerusalem. Wandering in the old city, he met Canadian Robert Humphrey, then 19. Humphrey had spotted Cohen on King David Street and followed him into a humusseria.
He just arrived from Sinai. With the UN ceasefire in place, he had left. He said, "I'm not playing any music for UN troops." He was adamant. I think he regretted not making a gesture during the Six-Day War. Remember, his father had been one of the first Jewish Canadian officers in the First World War. He did have a military pedigree. He had a certain fondness for guns. He wasn't a complete pacifist. He would have upheld the notion that there is a just war.
Moreover, as Humphrey notes, there was then, quote, "no sense of a Palestinian people. The Palestinians were Jordanian. No notion of a two-state solution. Jordan had been part of the attacking forces. Israel was fighting for its existence. There was no certainty it would survive. We were under attack and we had to stick together." Cohen told Humphrey that he wanted to visit the Kotel, the Western Wall. But when they arrived, he was in no rush to approach it.
Eventually, I said, "Are you going to pray?" He said, "No, I just want to look at it." We sat in silence for 10 or 15 minutes. Leonard then said that he had to do some shopping. "She's lost an earring, and I have to find a companion piece." I assumed she was Suzanne. He was looking for an earring in the shape of a hand, a hamsa, in a gold ring that dangled from the earlobe. We headed off in search of jewelry shops. Trays were produced, but he couldn't find the right size or shape. After 3 or 4 attempts, he said he needed to return to the bus station. At one point, I confessed that I had tried to read Beautiful Losers, but found it difficult to get started. He said, "Start in the middle. You might find it easier." There was no hint of defensiveness. The work just was the way it was.
Later, at the bus station, Cohen offered him a copy of the Jerusalem Post and a bag of licorice all sorts.
He glanced at the date and reminded us both that it was Halloween. He was giving me a treat. Then he pulled a pink notebook from his shirt pocket and with a felt tip pen, asked for my name and added it to the bottom of a list of names. He said there was a better chance of meeting again if I got to Montreal. Look me up. I'm in the telephone book.
Leaving Humphrey, Cohen reconnected with Usher and Marguerite and tried out Lover, Lover, Lover on them. According to biographer Ira Nadel, Usher told him, "You have to decide whether you're a lecher or a priest."
Cohen would never have wanted to choose between his libido and holiness, nor did he view them as a conflict. He strove in himself and in his work to create a fusion of the two.
Back in Tel Aviv, before departing, Cohen resumed his liaison with Rachel Terry. At one point, Terry confessed that she loved him, and it troubled him.
Yes, I fell in love with him, but why would an expression of love scare anyone?
Guilt may have explained it. More than a year after their first meeting, Cohen had not yet disclosed that he was a father. When he did finally tell her, Terry was dismayed.
She'd been pregnant when we met, but nevertheless, he did not hesitate to court me, not letting me know his true status. He said he was sorry. Can I forgive him? Of course I can, I replied, but why? He said because men are men, and when they desire or have chemistry with a woman, they hardly think. He just wanted my body and soul.
Leonard was unscrupulous, but as charming a scoundrel as they come. The old adage, "It's better to ask for forgiveness than permission," was written for him.
Eventually, Terry told him they could remain friends, but not lovers.
He wanted to see me, and I said, no for now, because I was hurt. I backed off because I wanted to let him be. He was 39 and I was 24, and he looked like an old man to me. Nevertheless, we dined and wined, walked many miles together, shared deep thoughts, laughed and cried, and established a friendship that lasted decades.
Before leaving Israel, Cohen had another brief fling with Elise, the Gad Hotel receptionist. Then he hopped another plane, not to Hydra, but to Asmara, capital of Eritrea, and booked into the city's best hotel, the Imperial. He often found hotels a spur to creativity. Quote, "The hotel room," he said, "is a kind of temple of refuge. There is the moment after the door is shut and the lights you haven't turned on illumine a very comfortable, anonymous, subtly hostile environment. And you know you found the little place in the grass and the hounds are going to go by."
It's in that hotel that he begins to reflect on his Sinai experience and finishes Lover, Lover, Lover. That's where that clarity started to emerge.
Back on Hydra, Cohen received a letter from his new friend, Usher.
Asher describes him as a passing wind and absolutely nails it. Leonard's trip to Israel mirrored the way he moved through the world. He left Hydra with a leather satchel, no hotel reservation, no plan. When he wasn't staying with strangers, he holed up in a flea bag hotel. His assignations were with unknown girls who recognized him on beaches and in movie lobbies. His face became his passport. This was quintessential Cohen, certain of his own destiny and confident that the universe would unfold as it should.
I want to thank our cast members for giving you a little tiny bit of the soundscape of this book, and turn now to some questions for Michael. Michael, you've said you wanted this project that you've spent so much time on to feature untold stories. And one of the things I was curious about was, how did you convince people whom you interviewed to open up? I'm particularly wondering about, what was your pitch for people who were reluctant to speak?
Well, I'll get to the question in a minute, but first I just want to do a little housekeeping and say thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank you to the Koshitsky Center and all the other sponsors for putting this evening on. Thank you to all the people tuning in. Thank you to the Coney Choir for your Oscar-winning performances. And although I I am not titled into a chair like David and Coleman. I am, for what it's worth, sitting in a chair. So as to your question, how did I persuade the reluctant? Well, sometimes, in fact, I didn't. I struggled mightily, I might add, with certain individuals, and sometimes I succeeded, sometimes I didn't. More specifically, I suppose I would say that my pitch was that Leonard Cohen is going to be with us for a very long time. His work is going to be read and studied. His life is going to be investigated. And so the people I approached, I would say to them, you're not just talking to me, you're talking for history, for cultural historians and academics and scholars and fans. And so sometimes that argument worked and sometimes it didn't. But it worked sufficiently to at least, produce these so far 2 volumes.
Thank you. So following up on this idea of creating a record for future fans and cultural historians, tell me a little bit more about your decision to write an oral biography in this way that reads like a play. What kind of experience were you trying to create for the reader?
So, well, the first thing to note is that there had already been a number of Leonard Cohen biographies in the English language, and 1 or 2, I think, in foreign languages. And I only read the English ones, and they were quite good. I suppose I could have embarked on that same path and written a conventional biography using the same interviews that I used, but I would have had to have left a lot of people out. You just couldn't accommodate 500 people plus the voices of 500 people. It would ultimately become a string of quotes in any event. Moreover, I am partial to the oral biography format. Not that it doesn't have limitations, it does have limitations. Hearing all these voices can be confusing for the reader, and I recognize that and acknowledge it. But at the same time, it kind of democratizes the view, the window on Leonard Cohen. You're hearing from people who knew him, whether they knew him for 10 minutes and had one meaningful encounter, or people who knew him for 50 years or more. And they have something interesting to say, hopefully. So I thought, that would be unconventional. It's not unheard of in the field of biography. There are many predecessors in the world of oral biography, but it isn't. It is a kind of narrow avenue, and I thought it would take me out of the equation. You would not be hearing Michael Posner's opinion of Leonard Cohen or Michael Posner's interpretation of this or that aspect of Leonard Cohen's character, but you'd be hearing from people who actually knew him and interacted with him, and you'd be getting beyond, I hope, the public persona that we all know, and not that the persona is false, it's just that it doesn't tell you the whole story. So hopefully these individuals that I interviewed are able to add some dimensions and some nuances to create a more complete portrait of Leonard.
Following up on that difference between public persona and private reality. Could you talk a little bit about that juxtaposition? Because I found as a reader, I almost felt like I was a member of a jury and I had to figure out who to trust, who to be wary of. And I also saw the public persona, and then you give us a bit of a texture of some of the private reality. Can you talk a little bit more about those two different, I feel like there are many Leonards, but can you talk about a little bit about those two?
You know, they're interesting in some of the interviews. Well, in one of the interviews I did with the poet and writer Dennis Lee, he says somewhere along the way, he says, who Leonard Cohen was an open question to which he was forever entertaining new answers, even if they contradicted the answer he had given 10 minutes ago or 10 days ago. And somebody else describes him somewhere else as being a gracious chameleon. And he does have a very chameleonic character. The public persona is the one we know sort of from the last incarnation of Leonard Cohen, the gracious old man, infallibly polite, infallibly witty, infallibly gracious, never saying the wrong word, extremely generous. And all of these things are true. I don't want to suggest for a moment that these are false aspects or that he was putting on a show. He wasn't by any stretch of the imagination. But at the same time, he was a human being, and behind the spotlight, and when the public wasn't looking, he was, conducting relationships, affairs, liaisons with women, sometimes multiple women at the same time. That can't have been easy logistically. It required that he compartmentalize his life so that people didn't know precisely who he was seeing, when he was seeing them, where he was at any given time. I think that must have exerted some sort of psychological pressure on him, for sure. But he managed to carry this off with considerable aplomb, I must say. So I think there is a tension between the public and the private, and I guess I saw it as part of my challenge, part of my assignment, to try to probe beneath that's the surface, to get to the real human being, and hopefully succeeded to some extent.
As a writer and someone who's invested a considerable amount of time, effort, and money in this project, what questions for you remain unanswered?
Oh, goodness. Many, I think. Just let's take politics for one. I've interviewed people who would say that Leonard Cohen was completely apolitical. I've interviewed people who say that Leonard Cohen was only political. I've interviewed people who think Leonard Cohen endorsed the far right wing, as he said to one of my interviewees, "I'm right of right." And I've interviewed people who are convinced that he's more center left. I've interviewed people who say he loved Bibi Netanyahu and people who say he hated Bibi Netanyahu. So politics would certainly be one area. Beyond that, I think Aviva Leighton, who was a good friend of his and had been a partner of the poet Irving Leighton's for many, many years, says somewhere that Leonard was above politics. He was below it, beneath it, beside it, to the right, to the left. He transcended politics in her judgment. And I think there's some truth in that. And I think to go further, that the more interesting part of whatever discussion I might have been able to have with Leonard Cohen or could have in the next life would involve his relationship with God, which, as you know, in his work is a constant kind of struggle and dialogue with God from the very beginning. Some of the earliest poems and some of the earliest songs, and right through to the end in the final album, You Want It Darker. His whole life can be read and interpreted as a dialogue with God, a kind of attempt to locate God, attack God, defend God, that whole, what he would have called the human predicament. And so I don't know that he ultimately comes away with any answers, and I don't know that whatever questions I might have for him would have been answered, but just to sit with him, as you may be able to tell from some of the conversations I had with the interviewees, just to sit with him for an hour on almost any subject was almost spellbinding. He was, apart from everything else, a master wordsmith, and he chose his words very carefully, and he was compelling, and he was skillful in debate and in argument. So that alone would have been fascinating. So I could have any number of questions, but I think the process of the conversation itself would be the price of admission.
Thank you. Something I'm wondering about this volume in particular has a heavy emphasis on his sexual relationships. And I know that one of the comments in the excerpt that we read was he didn't want to separate his libido from his religious impulses. But can you talk a bit about why that was given so much prominence in the book, kind of an incessant, almost Olympian infidelity with multiple affairs, women in their 20s, including a 15-year-old babysitter? Why was the sexual behavior so important in understanding who he was?
Well, I guess the simple answer is that this is the life he was actually leading at the time. It changes in volume 3, where he's an older man, and physical relationships are of somewhat less importance to him, although there are other relationships in those later years as well. I would say his idolization of women, his attempt to fuse the notion, as I think he puts it to somebody. I think he says to somebody, writers usually have one great idea, and my one great idea was to create the ultimate confusion between God and women. And so I think he had a very healthy libido. Somebody else somewhere describes him as promiscuous. I think the chase, the conquest was important to him. I think he was looking for women who could be his muses, who could inspire him. And he found several of these women who did function in that way. I don't want to say that he used them, because I don't think that would be fair to him. I think he did love them. He certainly loved them in the moment that he was with them, for all the times that he was with these women, even the ones that he hurt, overwhelmingly, they only speak well of him. To be with Leonard Cohen on almost any level seems to have been a quite special experience. Aviva Leighton used to describe him as magic. You don't hear that said about many men these days. He was a very special individual. So, I certainly wouldn't condone a relationship with a 15-year-old babysitter, and nobody would. And that's not a mark in his favor, clearly. But I think that's an aberration and an outlier that was not typical, although the women were often much younger, for sure. But he was a handsome guy. He was a charming guy. He was a brilliant guy, an amusing guy, and he was a rock star after all. He wasn't like he was a predator. He would perform, and when he got to the green room, the backstage, there'd be a lineup of women waiting for him, and he had his choice. Just at an elementary level, that must have been very hard to resist, and I don't think he worked very hard at resisting it. So I think these are important relationships, and they are part of that quotidian life that I wanted to explore. So I don't really apologize for their presence in the book.
Thank you. I have a question about how you determined categories for inclusion and exclusion, because I'm assuming you have much material that did not make it into the book, books,
Yeah.
plural. And two things I was just curious about that are not related, but I wondered if you could comment on. One is economic, and it's money. How much did he make and how did he spend it? Doesn't seem to be a lot about that in this volume. And the other thing I was curious about is the other question is historical, and that is, why is there not more discussion about the Holocaust in this volume?
So those are three questions there. The Holocaust first. Well, I think the Holocaust was very important to him, but it isn't something that he necessarily had many discussions with these individuals. And so there is another limitation of the oral biography method. I can't get inside Leonard's head itself. I can only get inside the head of the people he interacted with. And if that topic didn't come up or wasn't of any major importance, then there's nothing to report on. I think he was completely fascinated by the Holocaust. I think there is one story where the man who owned the restaurant across the street from his home was a Holocaust survivor, Mr. Solomon. And he used to go in there deliberately to talk to Mr. Solomon, who was a survivor, about the Holocaust and have private discussions. And they would go in the back and sit and talk. And I interviewed Mr. Solomon's daughter, Regina, who said this discussion was a complete revelation to her because her father never spoke about the Holocaust. But there he was with Leonard Cohen going on and on and on, telling his stories. No, I think Leonard was deeply interested in it. It just didn't surface. Money. Well, you have to divide his life into periods. Through the 1960s and even into the early 70s, he's not making a ton of money. He has finally, by the late 60s, he has a record contract. So there is some money, and he has some family money, but not a ton. And earlier, before that, he really struggled financially. He was doing freelance journalism to try to patch together what amounted to a living. Later, he starts to make considerable money, but money, it's my judgment that money was not terribly important to him. It was a means to an end. He used it to travel as frequently and as often as he could, and to stay in nice hotels on occasion, but he was not averse to, as Oshik Levy or one of the other readers said, not averse to sleeping on the canteen floor. And he would do that, his room, his bedrooms in his house were usually consisted of a bed and a night table, and that was it. Like, there was no rugs, no art on the floor. When he died, he was driving a 20-year-old Pathfinder, which he gave away when he knew he was dying, which he gave away to his gardener. He gave away a lot of money. He gave away a ton of money. That for him was what the money was for. He buys a store and a building for his daughter. He buys a house for his girlfriend. He gives money for another girlfriend to go traveling. He gives money to friends in need. He gives money to the Zen Center. He donated, I think, $500,000 to the Zen Center in one chunk at one point. Later, he joins a synagogue in Los Angeles, and he becomes their leading benefactor. Coming back from one trip, he writes a check for $200,000. So he got wealthier as time passed, and he gave that money away. He didn't spend it on himself. When he bought underwear and socks, he went to the discount store around the corner from his house. He didn't go to Neiman Marcus. Then, just quickly to add that when his former manager is accused of stealing and spending $5 million, he is more or less forced to go back on the road in 2008, and he does for the next 4 or 5 years, and made tens of millions of dollars. So he was very wealthy. What was the first question? I forget now.
I think you did a beautiful job of answering them very generously. Thank you. And I want to make room for all of the people that have joined us tonight for their questions. So I'm going to hand it over to Julie Feinberg to moderate. And this is an open invitation. If you have a question, please just drop it into the Q&A, and we're going to do our best to get to as many as we can. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, Julie.
Okay, so we have many, many good questions. We're going to start with one here. During the process of writing the book, did you ever find that you were self-censoring yourself? Were there some quotes, memories that you chose not to include? And if so, why?
Well, this goes to, I just remembered what Leslie's first question was about. There is a lot of material on the cutting room floor. I don't know if it falls into the category of self-censorship per se, but oftentimes people would tell me a story that involved Leonard, but ultimately turned out to be more about them than about Leonard. And so, although it was a struggle and very painful to cut 45,000 words from the second volume, more than half of that, I would say, was not so painful because it didn't really add much to our portrait of Leonard. There were times when I lost stories that I was sorry to lose, but I wanted to get the book published, and so I had to make those cuts. I don't think I had to self-censor much because my role here is so marginal. I'm here to connect the dots and set up situations and introduce themes and sometimes introduce characters, but I don't have an editorial role. And so there wasn't really much to censor. In the third book, I'm confronted with I will be confronted with an interesting situation because it deals in part, it covers the last years of his life from roughly 1987 to 2016. And it deals, of course, with the story of the theft or the loss of his money. And I have interviewed the woman who stole his money, who to this day denies stealing his money. And there are very few people who believe her, but she firmly believes that she is not guilty. And so it's a struggle to present that in what I hope will be a fair way. But I don't think I had many problems of that kind in volume 2.
Can you talk a little bit about the betrayal of the translator from Puerto Rico?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting woman who he meets in 1980 in Brussels backstage just before a concert. And they have a kind of letter writing relationship, mostly for the next year and a half. And the relationship physically isn't consummated until June of 1982 on the island of Hydra. And thereafter, although she's living mostly in Europe and he's living mostly in North America, they see each other quite frequently. And it ends for her without any sense of emotional closure when she becomes pregnant with his child, and unable to find him, unable to communicate with him, unable to tell him even that she is pregnant, at the age of 25 has to undergo a traumatic abortion. And he did, in a sense, from her vantage point, betray her. But it wasn't the infidelities that troubled her. It was her inability to find emotional closure in that relationship, which had been so profound and important to her. And it isn't clear to this day, although there's certainly evidence that suggests that he knew about the pregnancy, it isn't conclusive. And so, but that's a very important relationship because she is not only the woman who helped him translate the Lorca poem that became his song, his great song, Take This Waltz. She is also a woman who literally plays a role in some of the verses of Hallelujah, which he, as you know, in the lyric, he describes having his hair cut on a kitchen chair, being tied to a kitchen chair, and making love to a woman naked on a terrace. And both of those events, literal events, occurred with Gabriela Valenzuela. So she's an important person, and she has some really deep insights into who Leonard Cohen was. So I was very fortunate to find her, and very fortunate that she agreed to tell her story in as much detail as she did.
Do you know why that story never emerged before?
It's a really good question. He had opportunities to tell other biographers about her. He chose not to, or I don't know. I can only speculate here, so it's sort of pointless to do that. I would think he, at the same time, remember that he was conducting a much more public relationship with the French photographer Dominique Isserman, which was also an extremely important romantic relationship in his life, extremely important. And there's a good probability that Dominique did not know about Gabriela, although Gabriela had some vague awareness of Dominique. And so because that was a more public relationship. And it's possible that he wanted to spare Dominique the embarrassment, perhaps, of reading about an affair that she knew nothing about, that he was conducting virtually simultaneously on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean.
One of our audience members is asking if Leonard had ever thought about or had any perspectives on feminism.
Yeah, he was all in favor of feminism, at least publicly. There are people who would say that he's born in 1934. He's an adolescent in the late 40s. He comes of age in the 50s. Relationships between men and women were different. He was, for better or worse, a product of his time and its ethos vis-a-vis the sexes. So he did have some attitudes and opinions that I think probably wouldn't sit well in the modern world. But in general, I mean, he did famously say, it's about time that women ran the world, let's bring it on, or words to that effect, I think he was, and I must say this, this is really important. Leonard, as you know, and as we've talked about, pursued and bedded a great number of women, but he also pursued and had relationships, platonic relationships, with women, some of whom were lesbian, but many who were not, and he was able to function in a complete and open and warm and loving relationship as a friend with these women, and who deeply valued his company and his presence and his advice and his counsel and his support. I've talked to any number of women who would say, they knew him for a short period of time, but he had a profound influence. Sometimes he influenced their artistic endeavors and encouraged them, and encouraged them not simply with words, but with work. He would hire them to do certain things for his albums or his music. Sometimes he encouraged them on a spiritual path, to study with his Zen master, Sasaki Roshi, or another Zen master. There was a woman I met who I talked to recently who wanted to explore meditation in an in-depth way. And instead of immediately taking her to Sasaki Roshi, his own guru, if you will, he said, no, I think you should go with so-and-so. And she says, had he not done that, I probably wouldn't have been able to continue, because Sasaki Roshi would not have been the right choice for me. So he had these important relationships with women, and I can't tell you how loving their expressions of him are. I mean, he was able to do that. So I think it would be completely wrong to reduce him just to this seductive Lothario who's constantly on the make. I don't think that would be fair.
As you were writing these books and interviewing the various people who knew Leonard, did your personal views of him change over the course of writing the book?
I don't know if they changed because I was kind of tabula rasa to begin with, really. I mean, I knew his music a little bit and I'd read the biographies, or I certainly plunged into them when I began. So I don't know that I had a formed opinion of him that shifted as I learned new information. I would say I learned what I think is a lot about him. Although I have to say, I've done, I don't know, somewhere north of 550 interviews at this point. And I think that, if I didn't have deadlines and certain publishing realities, that I could keep going and find another 500 people who knew him often in as intimate ways as the people that I've already interviewed. And so I think there's a ton of other stuff to be learned about Leonard Cohen that I simply haven't stumbled across. I don't know that my opinions changed, but I think I have at least a basic understanding of who he was.
Well, I think we could probably continue speaking for a very, very long time as well, just as you could probably keep writing about this for a very long time. And we probably will like to speak to you again next year for volume 3. So I'd like to turn this over to David Kaufman now. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for a beautifully crafted interview, and to Julie, not only for managing the Q&A, but for all of your background, careful planning of yet another wonderful program. Thanks to our players and a bit of Zoom magic theater. Thanks to our IT tech dudes behind the scene. And of course, to you, Michael Posner. Michael, thank you for writing these books and for coming tonight with all of your candor and all your thoughtfulness. Audience, we hope that you hope and trust that you enjoyed tonight's program, and we look forward to seeing you at all of our future events, including the Shadows in the City of Light, Paris in Post-War French Jewish Writing, book launch with our own Sarah Horowitz, Amira Dan, and Julia Crete. That's on January 27th. And then our conversation with Nathan Englander, Monsters, Machines, and Modern Jews on February 27th. You can mark your calendars now and keep your eyes peeled for the registration information. Michael, thank you again so much, and thank you all for coming.
David, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, all the participants. And may I just say, if there's time, if anybody has questions that they wanted to ask and weren't able to ask, you can find me online. I think I have a website, and you can send me a question there, and I'm happy to answer it.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Hey, thank you, Michael.
Thank you again.